What is up, APUSH people? This video is for you to have a supplemental resource to review periods 1 and 2 of the APUSH curriculum in advance of your big day on May 11th. So please buckle up, take whatever notes you need, and I look forward to seeing you next class. So we're going to cover period 1, which as you know is only 5% of the test. It covers from Columbus, pre-Columbus, Native American populations, up to 1607. And the stopping point for that is quite obvious. That is the date of the first successful British colony at Jamestown. Period 2 is going to cover 1607 through all of the colonial developments as they develop their identity, as they experience the mercantilist system, through 1754, which we look at as kind of the end of colonial salutary neglect, when the British begin to start exerting a tighter control on the colonists. Period 1, 5% of your test, approximately. Period 2 is about 10% of your test, approximately. So in the next couple minutes, we're actually going to cover about 15% of your APUSH test. So please make sure you are at least familiar with what I have to say, and if not, you are taking notes about what to ask, what to look further into, and what else we can do to support you. So it's important that we understand that the Native Americans before British colonization, before Spanish colonization, before French colonization, have a very unique system of civilization, a unique system of trade and exchange and language that is not simply to say that there's just Indians in North America, because that's incredibly false. Now, if we're going to talk regionally speaking here, corn or maize is a huge part of civilization here where I'm circling in northern Mexico in the southwest, as many of these tribes rely on maize very heavily. In the northwest U.S., here what's considered for Native American populations in the eastern woodland, with famous tribes like the Iroquois and the Mohawk tribe, even the Powhatan Confederacy, they're going to be more dependent on hunting, on fishing, on foraging, more reliant on the resources that are around them as opposed to planting the resources for them. In the Great Plains, here in what's now considered the Midwest, the big boring part of America, a lot of their society is built on the buffalo, on hunting the buffalo, because there's a general lack of natural resources there from both a water and a growing and a seasonal standpoint. And then we have a mix of agriculture and hunting here and here as well. So it's important that we understand that these tribes are different from each other. They have different languages. They interact. Some of their interactions are peaceful. Some of their interactions are not peaceful. But it's a big takeaway to get our heads around the fact that one of the reasons they don't ever mount a significant organized resistance to British encroachment onto their lands is this different culture, different language, different beliefs, different perspectives. So while, yes, they are all considered Native Americans, they all have very different and unique characteristics. Cool. So what we see as the European nations begin colonizing is what will become known as the Columbian Exchange. So a variety of goods, a variety of resources, a variety of diseases and people and things and ideas are going to trade places, in a sense, from North America to Europe and to a smaller extent Africa. The significant impact on the North American continent is disease. There's also some crops, some animals introduced. Horses is a big one. On Europe, the significant impact will be much more crops, potatoes, for example, corn, for example. But it's important that you guys get your mind around the fact that the Columbian Exchange is simply this exchange of people and diseases and places and ideas from the New World, North America and South America and Latin America, to Europe. Now, as you can see on the map here, we have a variety of different regions that are colonized by the different European competing imperial powers. So we have the Spanish, which really take hold through the Caribbean, here what we now know as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, etc., and also through the southwestern portion of the North American continent, modern-day Mexico and the northwest United States, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. There's another good reminder of the Columbian Exchange for you as we see what is being exchanged: sugar and rice to Latin America. That'll play a big role later. Smallpox, as I noted, while Europe gets introduced to lovely things like maize, potatoes, tobacco, and syphilis, also a lovely thing. So it's important to understand what's happening with our different European powers. The Spanish, in particular, are going to have a really big impact on North America in the Southwest, as I pointed out before. They're going to create a new, much more aggressive caste system and a more racially diverse population than we're going to see in the British colonies, for example, with two new classes of individuals. One, the mestizos, which are considered mixed Spanish and native ancestry, and then the mulatto population, which is going to be a mixed Spanish and African ancestry. So with this new caste system, we're going to see the rise of what's called the encomienda system, which is in 16th and then part of the 17th century in the Spanish colonies. In the encomienda system, we see the natives being treated very harshly. We see the natives being used to build roads, to build infrastructure, very equivalent to slave labor. Eventually, and we'll get to this later, the encomienda system will be replaced by African slave labor. But it is important that we note a very clear similarity in both British and Spanish colonization in that there is a need for forced labor. Now, the way they go about it is a little different, but in both similarity is that in both colonization types, both nations, the British and the Spanish, are there to stay. They are there to colonize. They are there to take advantage of, and they are there to take advantage of labor. There are some significant debates amongst the Spanish about how they should be treated. An important name here is Bartolomé de las Casas, who is one of the first individuals who criticizes the Spanish way of treating the Native Americans. But a lot of this justification is going to be a clear continuity in American and all of European history, actually, in that the Europeans have supremacy, they have a more developed religion, they have a more developed political system, a more developed economic system, and therefore the natives are uncivilized. And that gives the Europeans, both British and Spanish, this justification to impose their will, to impose their beliefs, to impose their control on the native populations. This is going to become known much later when we cover imperialism as the white man's burden, when we justify doing the same types of things but in other places like the Philippines and Latin America. Again, in both cases for the natives and the Africans that are brought to the Western Hemisphere as slaves, both cultures are going to really, to differing extents, successfully preserve their autonomy, preserve their independence, preserve their culture, preserve what it is they want to do and who they believe they are. For the Africans, for example, we see combining Christianity with African religions, specifically in places where there's going to be a heavier density of African population. There's an easier way to keep your autonomy. And we do see communities across the southern part of North America, not a large number, but a significant number made up of runaway slaves. So big picture, it's important we understand these different colonial goals of our three powers that really play a role in North America. The Spanish colonies, of course, covering the southwest of the United States, what are now the United States. Their use of Native American labor, their treatment of Native Americans being very harsh, and a huge influx of diseases, which has a big impact on the native population. Now the French are a different approach. They don't have a whole huge number of settlers as opposed to both the Spanish and the British, and they get along way better with the Native Americans than any other European country. Now that's because their goals are really in line with what the Native American goals are also. Their goals don't conflict like we see with the British and the Spanish. In general, the French are just here for fur, and they're not here to take advantage of the Native American land or the Native American people or their culture. So they have a much higher coexistence rate with the natives. And we see that through such data as a large number of French settlers who end up actually intermarrying with the native population. Went too far. I apologize. Cool. So now we're going to focus a little more on the British specifically, since that's really the main focus of our class going forward. There's a couple of different reasons that people are coming to the colonies from Great Britain. In the 17th century, we see big changes in England. There's a huge population boom. And England's not a very big place. Land is not abundant in England because England, of course, is an island. And land is much more abundant in the New World, in what will become the United States. So there's a ton of competition for land in Great Britain. So if you lose that competition for a variety of reasons, you're going to want to have to go elsewhere. Political rights in England are largely determined on owning property. So if you don't own property in England, you don't really mean anything to anybody. There's competition for food, there's competition for jobs, and there's a huge mobile population of people in England that don't have really any answers to go societally, and that's going to cause them to look elsewhere. One of the places they look elsewhere is the New World and North America. One of the things that plays a role here are the laws of primogeniture, which say that only the firstborn male in a family can inherit that family's land. Which means that if you are the second, third, or fourth born male, you're kind of out of luck. Likewise, if you are a woman, you better marry a firstborn male because otherwise you also are out of luck. It's a couple of different choices people have. Some people move to cities, which creates a huge population boom in London that London's not really ready for. Others move to places like Ireland, Netherlands, or America, which at the time is the most expensive, the most dangerous because it's, of course, across the ocean and it's the least developed, but it also offers the biggest potential. Now, a couple of different motives for migration. We'd call these either push or pull factors, depending on how you want to look at it. There's a lot of religious motives. We see the Puritans and the Separatists in New England, for example, coming for reasons that they want to have a purer form of worship. We see Catholics coming to places like Maryland and elsewhere in the Middle Colonies, Pennsylvania, for the option of religious toleration. So there is the idea that you're not going to go somewhere and be told by the government what it is you're supposed to do religiously. That's a big motivation in the 17th century. There's a ton of economic motivation as well. To escape poverty, to try to get rich, to try to find gold, which of course we know doesn't happen, but there's other ways of getting rich. To escape poverty or the threat of lifelong poverty. A lot of young people look at their world and they realize, well, I'm never going to get out of the bottom class here in England, so I might as well go try something else. Or personal reasons, bad marriages, right? Who amongst us hasn't gone across the ocean to get rid of a bad marriage? We see people leaving because they don't want to pay or can't pay back their debt or to escape potential jail terms. So a lot of reasons people are leaving and a lot of reasons that the place they choose to come is America. A couple of significant events in England that really facilitate or spark this movement are the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, which both give people from a variety of different perspectives reasons to come here. Now, as the people come here, we're just going to start seeing some significant colonial subcultures developing. All right, some significant subcultures developing because what people come for is going to begin to dictate what people do when they get here. So, in a sense, who you are and where you're going is going to dictate what kind of society you're going to build. So the values and the desires and the perspectives and the morals of these migrants is going to create a different quote-unquote personality of these new colonies. And it's also going to create a huge division in terms of what these colonies are, what they stand for, and what they do politically, economically, and socially. But we look at these four regions as, and I put them in order for when they get settled, not geographically, the Chesapeake. So that would be considered eventually Virginia and Maryland, which we can later group with the southern colonies, but for now they're their own unique region of the Chesapeake. New England, which is the northeastern part of the colonial geography, Massachusetts and above. The middle colonies, which can be Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, etc., right there in the middle. And then later the Carolinas and Georgia, which are originally settled for more utopian perfecting of society reasons. But due to their proximity to the extreme slave culture of the Caribbean, they're going to quickly devolve into a much more aggressive slave plantation economy type of culture. So here is your handy map, which shows us our regional identities. So we have New England, which I told you is northeast up here. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, a much more religiously driven society. We have the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and I guess you can include Delaware, even though they don't really matter for anything. They're going to be driven more on commerce, trade, and quote-unquote breadbasket farming, or the type of farming that will be sustainable to feed a population, more agriculture based on food. And then you're going to have the southern colonies, which will eventually become a system of cash crop plantation economy, really driven, at least in the Chesapeake region, by tobacco, and further in the deep south by things like rice, indigo, and to a smaller extent, sugar. So we have our three regions, and it's important to understand that they're both a product of where they settle and why they settle. So where being the geography. In New England, we're not going to see a ton of a long growing season. We're not going to see a ton of heat. That's good for cash crops. So they're going to create a society that's not built on that. However, they also came for strongly religious purposes. So because of that, they're going to bring a unique approach to community building, to education, and to religion that we're not going to see elsewhere. Likewise, in the southern colonies, we see more people coming there to get rich. And that motivation combined with conditions that are ideal for cash crop plantation type of economies is going to create a system that reflects both that desire to come, why they came, and also where they settled. So these colonial identities, it's important we understand, are both a product of why they came and where they went. Cool. So from a colonial regional identity standpoint, the two that are most worth focusing on are New England and the Chesapeake/Southern colonies. Politically speaking, they're similar in the way that they're both really driven by colonial assemblies, by early forms of representative democracy where people are making decisions that represent their entire society. In New England, at least early, that membership in that colonial assembly to make decisions for your community is really driven by church membership. If you are a member in good standing of the church, you are eligible to serve in their democratic forum. In the Chesapeake and Southern colonies, it's going to be more driven on land ownership, and then later, big land ownership. Are you a big deal politically? Do you own a lot of land? And then they're with it, of course, do you own a lot of slaves? So in both cases, a clear similarity is that they're driven by early forms of democratic assemblies and representation, but who gets to serve in those bodies is, of course, a little different. Now, of course, it's important that we understand that really the first form of democracy in America is formed in the Chesapeake, in Jamestown in 1619 with the creation of the House of Burgesses. But we do see very similar houses of assembly in New England as well, which come off of documents like the Mayflower Compact, in which the settlers are all pledging to make decisions that are for the better of the community, not the individual. Socially, way different. New England is largely driven by families. There is a higher rate of women. There is a higher rate of lifespan. New England is really the first place in the world that we see the idea of grandparents, or people are living long enough to see their kids have kids. So it's very family-driven, very community-driven, very religion-driven, of course, by those Puritans that first come. And with it, very education-driven. We see New England as by far the most educated place in the colonies. And of course, that comes off of their religious nature, right? In order to engage in religion, you need to think for yourself, you need to read, you need to write. And therefore, we see for the first time in America tax-paid, tax-funded, locally run education systems. Now, we don't see that at all in the Chesapeake. Of course, I'm sorry, one more point is that despite the fact there are way more women in New England, it is still a very male-driven, male-controlled society. In the Chesapeake, it's a way especially early, a way more male population with a way higher mortality rate. Way higher mortality rate. It's very common for not only you not to get to grandparent age in the Chesapeake and Southern colonies, but not even to get to even raise your own children in this region. People are dying very early, and eventually this is going to lead more women to come to the Chesapeake and Southern colonies because there are not that many women there, and the women that are there have maybe a little more bargaining power because they are somewhat rare than in New England. But in both societies, you really see male-driven societies. Whereas New England is really driven by community and togetherness, the Chesapeake and Southern colonies are even very early driven by very clear social classes. There is a very clear middle, upper, and lower class in the Chesapeake, whereas in New England it's more of a blurred line because they are more driven by community. Economically speaking, in the Chesapeake, of course, they came to find gold. That didn't happen. And through a couple strokes of luck and good fortune, they dumb into tobacco, which is considered the black gold, the biggest cash crop of the 17th and then 18th century. With that, they're going to rely on indentured servitude originally to farm that tobacco. I'll get into that in a moment. But their economy is really built on cash crops, on big plots of land that are in general planting one thing, whether it be tobacco, rice, sugar, or indigo, depends on where you are and what you're trying to do. But it's important we understand that the southern economy is built on cash crops, where the New England colony is more based, it's a more mixed economy. There is some farming, not a ton to be traded, but much more for sustainability. But the economy is built on small artisan goods, small handmade goods, trade, shipbuilding, and lumber, which kind of go hand in hand because there's a lot of foresting in the New England area, and fishing. So different economies, different societies, political, there's a clear similarity, and that they're both driven by colonial assemblies, but also a very clear difference in that who plays a role, whether it be religiously driven or economically land-owningly driven. Cool. So here's a little refresher again on what the triangle trade is going to look like. Now again, this is the next step from the Columbian Exchange, because now we're involving manufactured goods and a much more developed society than what we saw with the Columbian Exchange. Now this is really what the colonies, what the purpose the colonies are going to serve for Great Britain, the mother country, is that the colonies are going to buy manufactured goods from Great Britain. That provides a market for Great Britain to sell their goods. What the role the North American colonies are going to play for Great Britain is to both buy their goods, as I said, but also provide raw materials back to Great Britain in the form of tobacco, indigo, flour, lumber, etc. Now that right there, this system that I'm tracing out with my pointer is the real root of mercantilism. That North America's job is to provide raw materials to the colonies, so that to Great Britain, so that they don't have to go get those raw materials from other countries, and then buy back manufactured goods. Also playing a role in this triangle exchange is the huge importation of slaves to the colonies, but a way bigger importation of slaves to the West Indies, many of whom, not individually but culturally speaking, will also then end up in places like the Deep South, Savannah, Charleston, and other places. Cool. So in these southern colonies, there's two very clear systems of labor that you need to know. The first is indentured servitude, and that is, in a sense, like economic and political slavery for a short term. You will serve 5 to 7 years on somebody's plantation or farm or in their home in exchange for free passage to the colonies, which, as I pointed out, is very expensive. So if you're an indentured servant, you get to come to America. You get to work for 5 to 7 years, and then you are set free and given property, whether it's a big plot, not usually, or a very small plot, much more common. But because you are in the southern colonies, with property comes voting rights. So it's very important for people in England to say, well, yeah, this might suck. The work's going to suck. Life's not going to be great, but I'm never going to get property in England. The only way I can afford it in America is by working as an indentured servant. Now, with this system of indentured servitude, we see the creation of what's called the headright system. In the headright system, the more indentured servants you pay to bring to Virginia or other places in America, the more land you are given. So this really encourages a ton of indentured servitude to come to America. Downside, about 1/2, if not more of them, die before the end of their service. So 1/2 of all of these indentured servants don't get to see freedom. But it's also important that it doesn't really deter people. 75% of migrants to the Chesapeake in the 1600s were considered indentured servants. So a huge portion of these people that are coming to the Chesapeake, to Virginia, and to a smaller extent Maryland, are indentured servants. So there's a lot of them, just a lot of them are also dying. This system really changes with the Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, in which we see indentured servants and free blacks rising up on the frontier against the colonial government, burning things down, as is the American way, and getting real wild and crazy in Virginia. That amongst other factors, like the fact that indentured servitude has become less popular because England's living conditions aren't quite as bad as they were before, leads America to make the full turn from indentured servitude as their cash crop labor system to African slavery. Bacon's Rebellion also is one of the significant events that makes restrictions on African Americans, both slaves and free, very strict because the settlers in Virginia realized that the free African population in Virginia is willing to rise up against their system as well, leading to stricter restrictions. As for African slavery, they are imported, of course, either from Africa or the West Indies, and they serve for life, unlike indentured servitude that has an expiration date. Give or take, during colonization time, it's impossible to get an accurate number. There's about 11 million slaves that are eventually brought to the English colonies. Now, slavery here in the colonies is unique in that it's called chattel slavery, which means that there's no ending date, that you are fully considered property, and as soon as you have a child, that child is then also considered property. Now, by 1720 in the colonies, the slave population is self-sustaining, which means, in theory, there's no more slaves that need to be brought in. The slave population is healthy enough and numerous enough that they can sustain themselves via reproduction. That's unique to America in the 18th century, where we don't see in Latin America or the West Indies and the Caribbean, we don't see a self-sustaining population of slaves because the death rate is so much higher that they're going to keep having to import slaves. Whereas in America, yes, they're going to keep importing slaves, but also the population is self-sustaining. An important early note in labor is in 1739 we have the Stono Rebellion, which is a huge rebellion of slaves in, of all places, South Carolina, of course. And that is another one of those rebellions that gives a huge rise to the desire to really restrict slaves from an education standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a social standpoint. With colonization also comes a large number of native conflicts, of course. These are the 5 you should know. The first lasts for a long time, 67 years, the Powhatan Wars. And they are wars against the Powhatan Confederacy in the Virginia region between the Virginia settlers who are trying to spread out and the Powhatan people who are saying no. Like most native conflicts, eventually they end with a white victory for reasons that are numerous: technology, resources, and of course disease. So that is a southern conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. The Pequot War, 1636 to 38, is in New England. The Massachusetts Bay colonists are spreading out. The Pequot people, of course, are not thrilled about that. They strike back. The war lasts for a couple years. And the significance here is that there is the near extinction of the Pequot people, allowing for Massachusetts to spread out into places like Connecticut, a little further from the shore. Shortly after, a couple years after, we have what's called King Philip's or Metacomet's War, which is 1675 to 1678, also in New England. In this case, this is significant because King Philip's War really is the end of Native American resistance to colonial expansion in New England. One of the reasons that the New England colonies are going to thrive economically and socially is that they're not going to have as much Native American resistance due to these wars, which really wipe out the Native Americans in New England. Another important one is the Pueblo Revolt, which actually doesn't happen to British colonists, but it happens in modern-day New Mexico against Spanish control, and they're really rebelling against the encomienda system. In the Pueblo Revolt, the natives are actually very popular, and they free themselves from Spanish rule for a short time. The Spanish later come back and reassert their control, but they do so with a much lighter hand. They do so much less aggressively, allowing for compromise between the Spanish and the native people. And finally, the Chickasaw Wars, it's just kind of fun to say, last for approximately 40 years between two tribes, the Chickasaw tribe, who are allied with the British, and the Choctaw tribe, who are allied with the French, and they're really going to be fighting over control of the Mississippi River. This conflict doesn't really end until the Treaty of Paris, 1763, which ends the French and Indian War, giving the British control. So it's important that we understand that there's a lot of continuity in the Native American conflicts, and they're going to carry on all the way really through to the late 1800s with the closing of the frontier and the final Indian Wars. Cool. Now, probably the two most important developments of period two are the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. Now, the Enlightenment, of course, is a scientific movement, a movement based on logic and science and reason that begins in Europe and spreads to the colonies. Benjamin Franklin is considered the American father of the Enlightenment, a very important name. Says he's bringing literacy and information with his Poor Richard's Almanac, a very famous, influential piece of journalism that spreads ideas to people. With the Enlightenment, we see for the first time this concept of natural rights. And with this idea of natural rights, that men are born with life, liberty, and the right to life, right to liberty, the right to property, we see this idea that the role of government should switch. That government should exist to protect our natural rights, and that government does not exist because God put them there. So we see really early beginnings of what's going to become democracy, as the Enlightenment emphasizes reason and science to solve problems as opposed to going to God. With the Enlightenment, we see a huge increase in literacy as people want to read and find out knowledge for themselves, which is going to play a role in the American Revolution shortly after. But the real big theme here is, of course, the role of government, natural rights. To a smaller extent, we'll see some things later like the separation of powers from Montesquieu. But the big theme is that people have the right to question their authority because their authority is no longer God, but their authority is the protection of natural rights and logic. Shortly after the Enlightenment, you could argue as a response to the Enlightenment, but really it's more so a response to a big decline in the colonists' religious devotion, is the First Great Awakening. Now, the complaint in the colonies is that religion is too impersonal, that if we're already predestined to go where God says we're going to go, then what's the point of living our life religiously anyway? And church is, frankly, boring. That's probably also a continuity in American history. The First Great Awakening really hits New England in the 1730s and later into Virginia on the frontier in the 1750s and 60s. And it's not really a unified movement. It's not planned. It's much more so a revival of people's desires to pursue religion. The names you should know here are Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Edwards, of course, is famous for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which he screams at people and scares them into becoming more religious again. But it really does reunite the desire to be religious, to pursue religion in the colonies. But we also get a bunch of really famous new universities out of the deal. Most of the Ivy League colleges you know today are founded in response to the First Great Awakening to train preachers. It's the first real national event. It's the first shared experience in the colonies. It's the first thing the colonists kind of all go through together as a unit. That'll play a role later. But the key theme here is that it empowers the non-religious elites, the everyday people, to challenge their religious authority. So while the Enlightenment, of course, is based on logic and science, and the Great Awakening is based on religious revivals, of course, very different things, science and religion, both of them inspire people to take power in their own future, to question authority, and to begin making their own decisions. Now, as we wrap up, dates matter. Not dates, but chronology matters. A couple of things we should know. 1607 is Jamestown. Yes, Brian Koo. 1607 is Jamestown. Very important date as it's the first successful British colony in North America. In Virginia, where Jamestown is located, in 1619, so 12 years later, we see the House of Burgesses created, a monumental date in the development of democracy, the first colonial assembly in the colonies, which is a huge positive. Of course, that same year is the first year that slaves are introduced to Virginia as well. So we could say that 1619 has both some pros and cons. 1620, just up the road in New England, we see the Mayflower Compact and John Winthrop as Massachusetts Bay becomes developed. We see John Winthrop, he is famous for his religious control of New England, of Massachusetts Bay specifically. And this idea that the New England colony should be, quote unquote, a city on a hill, a shining light and example for the rest of the world as to what Christian purity and community should look like. We see the tight control of religion in New England with the banishment, for example, of a Roger Williams or an Anne Hutchinson for not following the perfect way of pursuing the puritanical Protestantism that we see in New England. Which proves my point that New England is not a place of religious freedom. It is a place of freedom of their religion. A couple other important dates. 1649, Maryland passes an Act of Toleration, which tries to attract Catholics. It's not very successful, but it is a very important early document regarding religious freedom in America. 1660 and 1663, we see the Navigation Acts passed by the British, which attempt to reassert their control of mercantilism, forcing their colonists to only buy goods from Britain and only ship their goods to Britain and only ship all these things on British ships. There's some pros and cons here. Pro is it really allows for a New England shipbuilding industry to develop. A con is it keeps the colonists from trading with anybody else. But we do see a ton of not following of this law for a short time until the colonists realized that really the Navigation Acts are going to allow them to be more profitable anyway. And then finally, in 1689, the creation of the Dominion of New England, as England, to a small extent, starts trying to exert a little more control on their colonists, specifically in New England by putting them under royal control instead of letting them do their own thing. So, conclusions. By 1700, England's attitude toward the colonies has changed quite a bit, as they're looking more at the colonists as cash cows, as ways to make money. But we see a ton of sectional differences. The colonies have incredibly different sectional identities, even this early. As the South is based on cash crops and forced labor, New England is much more based on community, education, and religion, and the middle colonies really are the trading center, the commerce center, the most diverse, both economically, socially, and politically, of all three regions. All the colonies are technically still part of Great Britain, and they will be for the next 76 years. But they have very little to do with each other. It's easier to get across the Atlantic Ocean all the way back to England than it is to get from Massachusetts to Virginia. So the colonies have very little to do with each other, and it's going to stay that way for quite a while. And the colonists still look at themselves as very, very proud British subjects. They are very heavily consuming British newspapers, British books, British culture, British dress, British architecture, British food, British lifestyle, and they still want to be like Britain, and they still feel like they're a little brother that wants to get bigger. So that just about does it for periods 1 and 2. I hope that was helpful. And if there are any questions, please, by all means, write them down, shoot them my way, and I'll be happy to get them answered for you as soon as possible. Thanks much.